petition.
Yeah, I'm watching closely. I'm watching closely. Don't you worry.
It's my great pleasure to welcome Harjit Bhogal, who is at the University of Maryland, College Park, who specializes in philosophy of science and metaphysics, has recent papers in the Australian Journal of Philosophy, Philosophical Studies, PPR, and Noose, and was the winner of the Sanders Prize in Metaphysics, and will be speaking to us today on the topic of strikingness. Welcome, Harjit.
Great, thank you guys. I'm happy to be here, though obviously sad to be not actually there. But okay, so my talk today is going to be really very exploratory. I'm going to explore the idea. By the way, yes, Max is sharing my handout in the chat. I'm not going to present. There's going to be no slides. It's just a handout. So, okay, so my talk's going to be very exploratory. I'm going to explore this idea of strikingness, this idea that some facts are striking or call out for an explanation. So I'm going to use these terms, strikingness and calling out for explanation, synonymously. So I think this is a really deeply important concept in the philosophy of science and epistemology, but it's extremely underexplored, right? So Paul Horwich wrote a couple of somewhat related things back in the 80s on this. And Roger White has kind of circled around these issues in the past kind of 15 years or so in some of his work. And nowadays, Dan Barras, who's a postdoc at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, is like really digging into this concept more deeply. But apart from that, there's extremely little to note on strikingness. So my aim is just to kind of explore some of the landscape. That's at least the stated aim, right? Though I'm not really the type of philosopher who can just explore without kind of committing to something. So at the end, I'm going to commit to something. And that thing is, in fact, going to be extremely bold and extravagant. But it's the exploration which is the important thing. So just like, yeah, that's what's happening. Okay, so but let's just start by trying to give an initial characterization of this idea of strikingness, so we have some grip on what we're investigating. So let's start with a case. So imagine Max takes a normal looking pound coin out of his wallet and starts tossing it. And a strange thing happens, it lands heads 50 times in a row. Right. So this fact appears to be striking. It calls out for explanation. Right. And so when I say it calls out for explanation, this 50 head sequence, I don't mean anything psychological. I don't mean that the sequence would make us curious or would encourage us to investigate further or anything like that. Rather, I mean something epistemic. So the thought is that when a fact calls out for explanation, it's a mark against certain theories. That is, it's a pro tanto reason to reject certain theories. Which theories? Well, it's a pro tanto reason to reject those theories which imply that there is no explanation which properly answers the call for explanation. So that's like a little bit complicated. So I'll say more about that in a minute, but here's just a more intuitive way to put it. When a fact calls out for explanation, it's a mark against theories which say that the fact is just a fluke or a coincidence. Right. So for example, take the theory that the coin in question was just a fair coin tossed normally, that it really was this like standard pound coin that Max was tossing, and he was tossing it in a completely normal way, right? That theory implies that the sequence of 50 heads was just purely a coincidence, right? But that seems like a reason to be suspicious of the fair coin theory. If we really did see the sequence of 50 heads, we would start to think it's really unlikely that that's just a fluke. We would think that, oh, maybe it's a double-headed coin or something like that, right? We'd be inclined to reject the fair coin theory. Notice, though, on the other hand, if we observed a random-looking sequence of coin tosses, like heads, tails, heads, 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 tails, heads, tails, heads, heads, tails, this long random-looking sequence that you have on your handout, if we observed that, that would not provide us reason to reject the fair coin theory, right? We are perfectly happy to say that that random-looking sequence of coin tosses is just a fluke, but we're not so happy to say that with the uniform sequence, with the 50 head sequence of coin tosses, right? So just as an aside, notice that, I don't know if you probably haven't noticed, but this long sequence of coin tosses that I've listed on the handout, that's also 50 coin tosses, So notice then, given that it's a fair coin, assuming that it's a fair coin, then both this random looking sequence on the handout and the 50 head sequence have exactly the same probability. That is 1/2 to the 50, right? So whatever the difference is between the two sequences, it's not that, right? Okay, so where we're at is we have two sequences. We have the 50 head sequence, which calls out for explanation, and we have the random looking sequence of coin tosses, which does not call out for explanation, which we're happy to say is just a fluke, right? There's a complexity here, right? But because only certain types of explanations properly answer the call for explanation. So I'm just going to mention this issue briefly, but I'm going to mainly put it aside. So, okay, so take, for example, this potential explanation of why the coin landed heads 50 times in a row. Imagine that someone appealed to the exact microphysical details of each coin toss. Imagine they appealed to the exact spin and velocity and so on with which Max tossed the coin, and then appealed to the exact microphysical laws in order to show how those initial conditions imply that the coin landed heads every time, right? So in theory, such an explanation probably exists, right? But clearly, that's not the appropriate type of explanation we're looking for when we say that the 50 head sequence calls out for explanation. Even in light of this kind of microphysical explanation, it still seems coincidental that the coin landed heads every single time. So rather what we're looking for is a different type of explanation. So maybe an explanation which said that the coin was double-headed or something is the type of explanation that would make sense of the situation, that would make the sequence seem non-coincidental, right? So when a fact like the 50 head sequence calls out for explanation, it calls out for an explanation like the double-sided coin explanation, the double-headed coin, not an explanation like this kind of microphysical one, right? But the general question of how exactly we distinguish the appropriate and the inappropriate explanations in this context is pretty hard. I'm not going to go into it in detail. But roughly speaking, the microphysical explanation here just seems to be inappropriate because it's so fragile, right? It seems like that explanation could very easily not have held, that it relies upon fine details of the exact initial conditions. And consequently, it makes the kind of sequence of coin tosses, the 50 head sequence, seem fragile, right? What we would prefer is an explanation which makes the sequence seem more robust, right? For example, if the coin was double-headed, then we understand how it kind of could not easily have been false that the coin landed heads every time. So there's a lot more to say here, and in fact, I think these issues get at some very deep issues about levels of explanation in science. But for now, I'm just going to say that it's only robust explanations which properly answer the call for explanation, and so we can talk about that more in the Q&A. But okay, but given that, we can go back to the main thread, and we have our initial characterization of the notion of strikingness. So a fact which is striking is a mark against theories which say there is no robust explanation of that fact. So to be clear, I'm not saying that any theory that doesn't explain some particular robust, some particular striking fact has a problem, right? So plate tectonics does not explain why the coin landed heads 50 times in a row, but that is obviously not a problem with plate tectonics, right? It's okay for a theory to give no robust explanation of a striking fact. The problem is when a theory implies that there is no robust explanation of a striking fact. Right. That's the problem. Okay, so that's just like an initial grip on the concept, but just to help us get more of a feel for what's going on, let's consider some different examples. So I'm just going to list some examples of striking facts. Some of them I'm going to discuss briefly. Some of them I'll just mention and move on. So, okay, so we have the 50 head sequence that calls out for explanation, but so does a case like this. So I keep pulling numbered balls out of urns, but the numbers I pull keep on spelling out the birthdays of the people in this room or this virtual room, right? That's weird. That calls out for explanation. There are also a bunch of striking correlations, which you might think call out for explanation. So for example, there's a striking correlation between the mathematical truths and our mathematical beliefs, and like similarly in the moral case too, right? So for example, Hartree-Field says that the correlation between mathematicians' belief states and the mathematical facts is so striking as to demand explanation. It is not the sort of fact that is comfortably taken as brute. So this type of thought is at the core of arguments for certain anti-realist or reductionist positions about the relevant domains. The idea is that the correlation between beliefs and the truth is a mark against theories that don't give it a robust explanation. So notice that an explanation which makes the correlation extremely fragile. So an explanation which suggests that we could very easily have had completely unreliable beliefs. That's not the type of explanation that Field is looking for in this context, right? He's going to reject a theory which makes the correlation fragile, right? So we can see the importance of robustness here. Okay, here's a different example. Here's a scientific example. When two electrons are prepared in a certain way, their behavior in properly calibrated spin measuring devices is strikingly anti-correlated. When one is observed to have spin up, the other is observed to have spin down. That calls out for explanation. Here's another example. Higher level special scientific facts harmonize in a certain way with the lower level laws. For example, there are certain laws of population ecology which tell us how certain populations grow over time. But it's kind of somewhat strange and striking that the fundamental physical stuff, the atoms or whatever, always move in just the right way as to make these higher level laws true, right? That might seem striking. But there are plenty of correlations, we might call them spurious correlations, which are not striking, which do not call out for explanation. So here is a genuine fact. Between 2000 and 2009, the divorce rate in Maine was highly correlated with the per capita consumption of margarine in the USA. I take it that correlation does not call out for explanation. That is not striking, right? Okay, here are some more examples of striking facts. I'm just going to list some more examples. The continued regularity of the world, I think, is striking. So the world has been fairly uniform, right? The future has seemed to, broadly speaking, resemble the past. The strikingness of this fact, whether this fact calls out for explanation, is in fact at the core of a series of interesting arguments about induction. Right. Here's another example. The tides. The tides come in and go out at somewhat regular intervals. I take it we do in fact have an explanation of this, but still, it seems to call out for explanation. We just actually have one. Right. And here's the last example. The temperature of the microwave background radiation. So there's a type of radiation which is ubiquitous throughout the universe. You see it. It's the thing you see in the static on an old television, right? The microwave background radiation. It turns out that the temperature of that radiation is almost the same wherever you look in the universe, right? And that's a striking fact. In fact, it's going to be useful to look at this last case in a little bit more detail. So you guys should get psychologically prepared for about 4 minutes discussion of cosmology. So just get ready for that. Okay, so standard Big Bang theory, that is to say the version of Big Bang theory that was standard in the 70s and the 80s, it faced a problem. And the problem was, if we look anywhere in the universe, the microwave background radiation is basically the same temperature. So this type of thing isn't normally puzzling, right? If you put a hot thing like next to a cold thing, they typically end up becoming the same temperature. But this type of thermal equilibration procedure isn't what's going on in this case, right? Because assuming standard Big Bang theory, there are relevant regions of the universe which are so far apart that the equilibration procedure could not have worked without things going faster than the speed of light. So basically, that is, there's a region here and there's a region here, and they both have the same temperature, but they're so far apart in the universe that there can never have been any interaction in the history of the universe between those regions. So therefore, the sameness of temperature cannot be due to any thermal equilibration procedure, right? So this is strange. Why do these things have the same temperature? So interestingly, this uniformity is not inconsistent with standard Big Bang theory, right? Rather, it just requires an extremely particular choice of initial conditions in order to explain the result, to explain the uniformity. But physicists are very unhappy with the kind of fragility of this explanation, right? And they take this to be reason to favor alternative versions of Big Bang theory, which can give more robust explanations of the uniformity of temperature. So Guth and Steinhardt, for example, two like very famous cosmologists, say that one of the major advantages that inflationary Big Bang theory has, that is a variant Big Bang theory, one of the major advantages it has over standard Big Bang theory is that from almost any set of initial conditions, the universe evolves to precisely the situation that had to be postulated as the initial state in the standard model. So that is a claim about robustness. What they're saying is the problem with the standard theory is that it has a not robust enough explanation, while the inflationary theory has a good, robust explanation. So I think this is a case where the uniformity of temperature calls out for explanation. It having no robust explanation is a problem for theories like the standard theory. Right. And there's another important feature of this case too. So as we noted, given the standard theory, we need to kind of fine-tune the initial conditions in order to explain the uniformity of temperature. But this isn't just true for the uniformity. In fact, in order to explain any particular distribution of temperature, we would have to fine-tune the initial conditions. But this in itself is not a problem for the standard theory. The mere fact that the standard theory can't give a robust explanation of the distribution of temperature is not a problem with the theory. The problem is that the standard theory can't give a robust explanation of the distribution of temperature and that distribution is uniform. It's the uniformity which calls out for explanation, while other distributions of temperature throughout the universe do not. Right. So this case, I think, this case is basically structurally identical to the coin case, right? But I think it's a good one to illustrate the force of strikingness in scientific practice. The uniform distribution of temperature is a striking fact. Other distributions of temperature are not striking. And the kind of lack of a robust explanation of a striking fact is a major reason to reject some live and, to that point, well-confirmed scientific theory, that is standard Big Bang theory. Right. Okay. So one last clarification about strikingness before we move on to consider some possible accounts. The cases we described should make clear that strikingness has a kind of important role to play in theory choice, right? In all of these cases, a theory saying that a striking fact doesn't have a robust explanation is a pro tanto reason to reject that theory. But this is kind of importantly different from some other cases where you have reason to reject a theory. So just imagine, for example, you have a particular theory of how the stock market works. And your theory implies that some stock will have a high price, but that stock, in fact, has a low price, right? So that is a pro tanto reason to reject your theory. But the fact that the stock has a low price isn't striking in the relevant sense. It doesn't call out for explanation any more than any other fact, right? One way to make this point is that the low price of the stock isn't a mark against any theory which says that it doesn't have a robust explanation. We might be perfectly happy to accept some theory of the stock market which says that the low price of that stock is just merely a fluke, right? What's going on in this case is the low price of that stock is a mere counterexample to your theory. It's not a fact which especially needs explanation. So I think going forward, we need to be mindful of the distinction between facts which really call out for a robust explanation and other facts which might be surprising and puzzling, but just because they're counterexamples to your favorite theory, right? Okay, but good. So given all that, we can start to talk about some accounts. So there aren't many accounts in the literature, so I'm going to talk about some accounts in the literature and some accounts I'm just going to invent and then criticize my invented accounts, right? But let's start with this one. So I think maybe the most common reaction to things like the coin toss case in the pretty sparse literature that there is to say that when the coin lands heads 50 times in a row, there are some kind of pretty natural alternative hypotheses that are suggested. So maybe, for example, it's a double-headed coin, or maybe Max has practiced so much that he's become a kind of a master of coin flipping, right? But when the sequence is heads, tails, heads, 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 blah, 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 the long random looking sequence. When that's the sequence we observe, there's no kind of natural alternative hypothesis that is suggested. Now, of course, there are hypotheses that would make sense of this random looking sequence. Maybe just like coincidentally, that random looking sequence is Max's favorite sequence. And then he loves to replicate that with his coin tosses or something. But that seems like just a very strange and unnatural hypothesis, right? So this kind of consideration is what motivates Paul Horwich's theory of what makes a fact surprising. So Horwich's theory is technically an account of surprise, not an account of strikingness, but others have talked about it as if it's an account of strikingness, so I'm just going to do that too. So Horwich's theory says that a fact is striking if and only if the fact is unlikely given your theory, and there is some alternative theory that you think is not wildly improbable that makes the fact likely. So call this the alternative hypothesis view of strikingness, right? So the random looking sequence of coin tosses isn't striking on this view because all of the hypotheses that would make sense of the sequence just seem really implausible, right? Okay, so that's the view. Here's the problem. Some facts are striking even when there's no alternative hypothesis that you take to be not wildly improbable, right? So Roger White at one point mentioned the example of you have a handful of sand and you just throw it up in the air and the grains of sand land in a perfect circle. It's like really hard to see what the alternative hypothesis is here that's not wildly improbable. But clearly, that fact is striking. It calls out for explanation. Or maybe consider a different type of example, right? Go back to the uniformity of the microwave background radiation, and imagine we've like just observed the uniformity. We've just noticed that wherever we look in the universe, it's the same temperature. But given that we've just done that, we cannot yet formulate any sensible looking theory that would make sense of that fact, right? Because formulating such scientific theories is hard. But clearly, the fact is still striking, even though we don't have an alternative hypothesis, right? Okay, so that was the objection. Here's a possible response to the objection. So someone might say, look, okay, fine. Maybe sometimes we can't formulate a specific alternative hypothesis that would make sense of the relevant striking fact. But what about the kind of catch-all hypothesis? The hypothesis that there's something, whatever it is, that makes sense of the striking fact. Isn't that the kind of relevant alternative hypothesis in some cases? And the kind of concern here is that if we allow this, that basically reduces Horwich's theory to saying that a fact is striking if and only if it is unlikely given your current theory, and it's not wildly improbable that there is some hypothesis, whatever it is, that makes the fact likely. So that just comes like super close to simply giving Bayesian conditions for when your current theory is substantially disconfirmed. Right? So on the Bayesian approach to confirmation, for your theory to be substantially disconfirmed by a fact, there's kind of three relevant conditions. So the fact has to be fairly unlikely given your theory. There should be an alternative theory in which the fact is more likely. And this alternative theory has to be like reasonably probable, right? But those are just basically the same conditions that are given by this adapted version of the alternative hypothesis view, right? Okay, so what I said there was like extremely loose and extremely quick. We can talk about this more in the Q&A, because there is a difference between the Bayesian stuff and the alternative hypothesis view. But it's, I think, to do with the fact that the Bayesian conditions are kind of graded in a certain way, while the alternative hypothesis view has thresholds, right? But kind of modulo that, I think these conditions are virtually identical. And so the concern, basically, is that the alternative hypothesis view, where we allow in this kind of catch-all hypothesis, just comes really, really close to merely saying that a fact is striking when it substantially disconfirms your current theory, right? And the problem is that this view just seems uninformative. We want to know why certain facts, like the 50-head sequence of coin tosses, disconfirm theories that don't explain them. and why other facts, like the random looking sequence of coin tosses, do not disconfirm in the same way. And so this version of the alternative hypothesis view just doesn't really do that. So I think neither version of the alternative hypothesis view is satisfactory. One of them has counterexamples. The other one just like looks suspiciously close to uninformative and trivial, right? Okay, here's a different kind of reaction to the coin toss case. Imagine someone might say, okay, so in the 50 head sequence of coin tosses is very simple or easily computable, right? And in a way that the random looking sequence of coin tosses is not. And so maybe we can try and develop that idea into an account of strikingness. The thought being that striking facts are facts which are simple in some sense of simplicity to be specified. I don't think this is a particularly reasonable, sorry, it's reasonable, but I don't think it's a particularly promising approach. To see this, kind of consider the urns case again, right? Where I pull numbered balls from urns, and the numbers I pull keep spelling out the birthdays of the people in this room. So in that case, the sequence of numbers that I pull is not particularly simple, but it is striking. Right? And so maybe the defender of the simplicity approach here could say something like, well, you haven't properly individuated the relevant striking fact here, right? Rather, the simple fact is the connection between the numbers and the room and people's birthdays, right? That's the simple thing. And I think that's a reasonable enough suggestion. And more generally, I think there are lots of ways that the defender of the simplicity approach might want to develop their view. But I'm just pretty doubtful that any of them are going to work. And here's the general concern. It's that some facts, like the matching between the numbers and the birthdays of the people in this room, seem to be striking because they have a certain significance to us. And the prospects for reducing this notion of significance to some story about simplicity, I don't think that's particularly promising, right? But maybe some of you disagree, and if you do, we can talk about that. Okay, here's a different type of reaction to the coin toss case. Here's a third possible approach. You might say that the 50 head sequence has some very atypical features, and that's why it calls out for explanation. So this notion of typicality, it means a lot of things to a lot of different people, but I'm going to understand it in roughly the way described by Adam Elgar and Robbie Williams in some of their work, though they're considering like completely different issues to what we're considering, but we can kind of still import their idea of typicality to this context. So the idea of typicality is that there are certain features of sequences which have very high probability given your current theory of the situation. So call those normal features. And a sequence is atypical if it lacks a normal feature. So for example, it's high probability given your current theory of coin tosses that in a long sequence of coin tosses, there will be about as many heads as tails. It's also high probability that the heads, tails, heads subsequence will appear about as often as the tails, heads, tails subsequence, right? The thought is that an atypical sequence is going to lack such a normal feature, right? And we can say then, to develop the view, that a sequence is striking if and only if it is atypical. And so clearly the 50 head sequence is atypical in this sense, and therefore is striking. So here's a pretty obvious problem with this approach. It's that every sequence, or every long enough sequence, seems to be atypical in some way, right? So go back to the random looking sequence of coin tosses, like heads, tails, heads, 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 blah, blah, blah. So that random looking sequence has a particular property. It has the property of being constituted by that exact sequence of heads and tails. And it's very low probability that sequences will have that exact property. But then it looks like the sequence is going to count as atypical in virtue of having that low probability feature. But that's just like obviously the wrong result. We don't want to say the random looking sequence is atypical, right? So Elgar kind of addresses this kind of issue. And his solution to the problem is that we need some constraints on which properties count as relevant for typicality, right? So his approach is to appeal to simplicity. He says that the relevant properties for judging whether a sequence is atypical are ones which are simply defined in terms of some canonical vocabulary. So for example, it's relatively easy to define the property of there being about as many heads and tails. So that's a property that counts towards whether a sequence is typical. But properties like being constituted by the exact sequence of coin tosses, heads, tails, heads, 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 tails, blah, 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 that property is much more complicated to define, and so is not relevant for typicality. But I think this approach just fails for like the same reason as the last approach, right? I think it doesn't look like this appeal to simplicity can capture cases where things are striking because they have a certain significance to us. And so maybe instead we could just forget about simplicity and try and come up with some other constraints on what the relevant properties are for typicality. This, I think, is a very reasonable project, but it is, in effect, the project of trying to identify the properties that few sequences have, and in virtue of which those sequences call out for explanation. So it's basically just a slightly different framing of our project about strikingness, right? It's just not an advance over where we started, right? So I don't think this appeal to typicality really helps us with the project. Here's a very different type of approach. I'm going to skip one approach on the handout, the deviations from normality thing. It's not very interesting. Here's a different type of approach. The deflationary approach. So far I've been talking as if strikingness is this kind of unified phenomena, which has a substantial role to play in our theory choice. So a fact being striking provides a distinct reason to reject theories that don't give a robust explanation of that fact. But maybe that's not the case, right? Maybe strikingness is just a label we put on facts where other epistemic principles lead us to believe the fact has a robust explanation. So maybe sometimes you have an inductive reason to believe that there's a robust explanation. Sometimes you have an inference to the best explanation based reason, and so on. So if this is the case, then strikingness isn't unified. We can come to believe that facts have a robust explanation for all sorts of different reasons in different cases, right? And the strikingness of a fact will not provide any reasons for belief that are distinct from the ones that we already have. So this is a very interesting and promising view, right? I mean, if any of you have seen the full version of the paper, you see that I say a lot more about it there, and maybe we can talk more about it in the Q&A. And in particular, I have some doubts about whether our epistemic principles can really do the work that the deflationary approach needs them to do. But here's just a quick reason to be doubtful of the deflationary approach. So take the microwave background radiation case again. So we discussed that case for like 4 minutes, right? That relatively brief discussion of the case, I think, allowed us to correctly perceive that the uniformity of temperature of the microwave background radiation is striking, right? Now, we don't need to be experts in cosmology to do that, right? We don't need to know a lot of extra detail about the case to make the judgment that that fact calls out for explanation. We don't, for example, need to have evidence about prior cosmological theories so that we can perform inductions. And we don't need to make judgments about the relative simplicity of standard Big Bang theory compared to alternative theories. What we have is a quick and clear judgment of strikingness in this kind of case. And that quick and clear judgment would, I think, just not be possible if strikingness was merely a label we put on the way we balance all of these other epistemic principles, right? So that's a very quick reason that I think to be doubtful that the deflationary view works. I think strikingness is not fully reduced to other epistemic principles. But there clearly are some cases where our reason to think that a fact has a robust explanation does derive from other epistemic principles, right? So consider just like a simple case of testimony. So imagine a reliable scientist comes up to you and says, that fact, P, has a robust explanation, but then doesn't tell you which one. Well, clearly that's a pro tanto reason to reject any theory which doesn't give P a robust explanation. So given that kind of case, we face a kind of terminological choice. We could continue to use terms like striking and calls out for explanation to refer to any facts where we have reason to be doubtful of theories that don't give a robust explanation of those facts. Or we could reserve those terms for facts where those reasons aren't fully explained in terms of other epistemic principles. So I think the second thing fits better with the intuitive notion of strikingness and with the discussion so far. So that's the way I'm going to use the terms in the rest of the paper. Right. Okay. So on to the weird stuff. So I'm going to suggest a different type of approach there, an alternative to some of these approaches. It's pretty bold. It's pretty weird. Maybe, in fact, the best version of this view that I'm going to suggest is going to end up being kind of somewhat nuanced and weakened in certain ways. But I'm just not going to do that. I'm just going to give you the simple, direct version of the view and kind of suggest that it has some plausibility. Okay, so the starting point of this view, although it's a kind of weird approach, I think, the starting point of the view is that there was something right about the alternative hypothesis view, right? The thought that the difference between the 50 head sequence and the random looking sequence of coin tosses is kind of something to do with the alternative ways that the 50 head sequence could have come about. I think that's extremely compelling, right? So when I toss the coin and it lands heads every time, or when Max does it, it's natural to suspect that it's a double-sided coin or something like that, right? The alternative hypotheses that are suggested are ones which give the 50 head sequence like the feel of like a magic trick or something like that. And I think a similar thing is true in the urns case too. When I pull numbered balls from urns and they keep spelling out the birthdays of the people in this room, that has kind of the feel of like a trick or a conspiracy or something like that. And in fact, I think the same is true for other examples of strikingness we considered. They have the kind of appearance of a kind of conspiracy, at least until we can give an alternative, non-conspiratorial explanation. So take, for example, higher and lower level laws, the fact that the higher level special scientific laws harmonize with the lower level ones. It's very common to call this a conspiracy problem. So Callender and Cohen, for example, say that there appears to be some metaphysically extravagant conspiracy among the fundamental particles to move in just exactly the ways that make the laws of, say, economics or population ecology turn out to be true. Similarly, in the quantum entanglement case, there's a kind of appearance of conspiracy here, of the fundamental particles kind of conspiring, so to speak, to make it the case that the spin behavior of the particles is strikingly anti-correlated. In fact, there are various possible explanations of this phenomenon which get called conspiratorial, right? And actually, I think in pretty much all the cases of strikingness, there is something like this feeling of conspiracy. And I mean conspiracy in like a literal sense, a feeling that there is some agent behind things, right? So to put it another way, here's the idea. Striking facts have an appearance of authorship. So in cases like the coin toss case and the urns case, this might seem like a reasonable suggestion. In those cases, a conspiracy, a trick, is a live and reasonable hypothesis, right? But it's a stranger suggestion in cases like higher level laws and microwave background radiation, where, at least for those of us who are not theists, we do not take there to be an author controlling things, right? So, however, I want to claim that even in these cases, there's still a kind of appearance of authorship, even though in some sense we might judge the authorship hypothesis to be unlikely to be true. I'm going to have to move past this quickly, so maybe we can talk about this more in the Q&A, but I want to appeal to a distinction that's often made in the literature on inference to the best explanation between likely and lovely explanations. So an explanation is likely when it has a high probability of being true. It's lovely when it would give us a lot of understanding if it were true, right? And the thought is that a fact has an appearance of authorship when the authorship hypothesis is a somewhat lovely explanation, right? So that's the sense I want to say in which facts are striking when they have the appearance of authorship. We can talk more about this likeliness, loveliness distinction in the Q&A if people want. Okay, so that view, this simple view, strikingness as appearance of authorship, I think gets some pretty intuitive results. So in the microwave background radiation case again, the thought is that the uniformity of temperature gives some appearance of authorship. That uniformity, especially without any obvious cause, gives some impression that there is someone producing the uniformity. The thought is something like that an author would more naturally select the uniformity of temperature as opposed to some other random distribution, right? And I think we could say similar things about the other striking regularities or correlations. Similarly, in the Ernst case, I think, where the patterns observed have some significance to us, I think that very much suggests an author. On the other hand, I don't think anyone would judge the spurious correlations, like the fact that between 2000 and 2009, the divorce rate in Maine was highly correlated with the per capita consumption of margarine in the USA. I don't think that anyone would think that that suggests that there's an author controlling things, right? And this account also avoids many of the other objections that were raised against other accounts, right? It's certainly not trivial and uninformative in the way that the alternative hypothesis view threatened to be. At this point, though, like, it's extremely reasonable to be unconvinced and to be very unconvinced, right? So maybe the authorship idea sounds somewhat intuitive, right? Maybe if you reflect on the examples of striking facts that have come to your mind during the talk, maybe those reveal something like an appearance of authorship in those cases. But so far, I've just not done very much to support the view. And in particular, here's the major source of concern, I think, right? So just what does the appearance of authorship have to do with the need for explanation? How are those things just in any way related to each other? I think that's a good question. And so I'm going to discuss an important consideration relevant to answering that question. This is going to involve a bit of a detour through psychology. We're going to come back to some epistemic issues just in a minute. Okay, so there's a huge amount of work in psychology and in cognitive science and in related fields about the ways in which humans see agency and authorship everywhere. Humans have a very strong inclination to understand phenomena in terms of agency. So the most classic example comes from Hyder and Simmel in 1944, who made an animation in which kind of geometrical figures like circles, squares, and triangles and so on move in systematic ways. So the people who watch this animation consistently describe the figures as if they were real people with goals and desires and who move because of those goals and desires, right? So they say things like the circle is chasing the square is trying to get away, that kind of thing. And in fact, there's lots of evidence that from the time that we're babies, we're inclined to attribute agency to features of the natural world. And there's a very large literature, I'm thinking of people like Pascal Boyer and Scott Atran and Stuart Guthrie, which appeals to this human pull towards agency-based explanations in order to explain the widespread existence of religious thinking among humans. Right. So a common hypothesis here is that we have a distinct module for perceiving agency. So for example, Atran claims that the concept of the supernatural agent is culturally derived from innate cognitive schema, mental modules, for the recognition and interpretation of agents such as people and animals. And furthermore, the thought is that this module exists due to the huge evolutionary importance of noticing agents in our environment, right? Consequently, we kind of automatically form these hypotheses about agents. So this is another quote from Atran. If we or our ancestors were to find that the scratching at the door or the howling in the air was not the stalker that seems automatically to first come to mind, but only the play of branches and leaves in the wind, we would suffer nothing. But if there were a stalker, we would be prepared and likely to suffer less than if we weren't. So these agent-based explanations of phenomena and the phenomena which trigger these agent-based explanations are, for evolutionary reasons, extremely salient to us. And their salience is kind of immediate and automatic, right? Okay, so given that, here's the somewhat speculative bit. The salience of these agent-based explanations is going to affect what we feel needs explanation. So in particular, when we observe a fact that has the appearance of authorship, we're going to be immediately and automatically drawn to some agent-based explanation of that fact. And this has implications for how we think about the way in which these facts need explanation. Right. So consider a case where there's a reasonably strong appearance of authorship. Imagine I'm in bed late at night and I hear something which sounds like a voice from my living room. And this sound and the agent-based explanation of the sound are kind of unsurprisingly, extremely salient to me. And in this case, I have a kind of a few epistemic options, right? So maybe I could come to believe the agent-based explanation. So I could believe that there's a person in my living room. I could come to believe some other explanation of the sound. So maybe like my wife's phone is still connected to the Bluetooth speaker in the living room and she hit play on a podcast she was listening to earlier, right? Or maybe I could be agnostic. Maybe I could say, okay, well, there's no other signs of there being someone in the living room, so it's unlikely that someone's there, but then it's hard to see what the explanation of the sound is. In this case, I would kind of be on high attention, looking for what the potential explanation of the sound is. What's not psychologically plausible is just to ignore the sound and not have it affect my reasoning. It's not plausible that I could or would treat this sound in just the same way as lots of other sounds that come from my house. It would be very difficult to treat this sound as just a strange fluke or a coincidence, right? And I think similar type of reasoning holds with the cases that we've been considering, like the Ernst case or the microwave background radiation case. I think in this case, the kind of appearance of agency, the kind of weirdness which people identify, which seems like, it's strange that there's something strange going on here. That appearance of agency and authorship, I think, are very salient. And in these cases, we have a few epistemic options. We could come to believe the agent-based explanation, right? So people taking this option about a variety of natural phenomena is, in effect, the genesis of religious thinking, according to many authors, right? We could come to accept some other robust explanation of the phenomenon in question, or we could be agnostic, right? We could be on high alert and on the lookout for potential explanations. But I think similarly, in these cases where we see something with the kind of appearance of authorship, it's psychologically implausible for these facts not to affect your reasoning. Facts like the numbers pulled from urns matching the birthdays of the people in this room or the uniformity of temperature. It's psychologically difficult to dismiss those facts as some fluke or coincidence, precisely because of how powerful this process of agency detection is. Just in the same way, it's psychologically difficult to dismiss the human-like sounds you heard late at night as just a fluke, right? And so in these cases then, and other cases where there's an appearance of authorship, the huge salience of agency, these agency-based explanations, affects our feelings of what needs to be robustly explained and what we're happy to take merely as flukes. And I think this helps us answer the question from earlier. It makes less puzzling that there could be a connection between the feeling of authorship and the need for explanation. When there's a fact with the appearance of authorship, it becomes extremely salient to us, and that leads to this feeling of needing explanation. Now, this discussion is somewhat speculative, but the way in which we're automatically pulled towards agency-based explanations and the salience that those explanations have for us, that's not speculative, right? And if it's right that this feature of our psychology is what's ultimately responsible for the religious thinking that's been hugely influential across basically every culture ever, then it's not particularly surprising, I think, that it might have some effects on our scientific and everyday reasoning about explanation. Okay, I'm just going to finish with this. Here's an extremely obvious issue with this discussion. Earlier, I was clear that strikingness is not a psychological phenomenon. It's an epistemic one. If a theory implies that a striking fact doesn't have a robust explanation, that's a problem for the theory. But what does all of this stuff I just said about psychology have to do with epistemology? How does this discussion of the appearance of authorship and agency detection give us any evidence about what's likely to be true or about what we should believe? Doesn't this stuff just tell us more about ourselves than it does about the world outside ourselves? And this, I think, is a very forceful worry. But in fact, I think kind of similar worries can be raised for other considerations that are relevant to theory choice, like simplicity. At least some appeals to simplicity in theory choice seem kind of subjective and psychological in the same way. Though there's a huge literature on simplicity that I can't fully get into here, but maybe we can talk about more if people want. But still, there's a sense in which certain simplicity considerations seem subjective and psychological. And I think it's hard to know how to square the way in which these theoretical virtues, like simplicity and strikingness and maybe others, the way in which they seem to be largely driven by facts about our psychology, with their genuine role they seem to play in theory choice, in science, and everyday life. So I don't know if any of the options here are like super pleasant, but one possibility is to take the discussion here as debunking intuitions about strikingness, right? Saying they should be thrown out. But the option I'm inclined to accept is that the role of things like strikingness and simplicity in our theory choice is evidence for certain views of epistemic normativity. That is, views where facts about psychology play a role in grounding facts about what we ought to believe. And so work in metaethics has shown us like a lot of different possibilities here, right? We could have, there's various kinds of relativism could work here. So could subjectivism. So could like some kinds of constructivism. Also kind of views where the normatively relevant properties are like response-dependent secondary qualities, right? There's a whole bunch of different options here. But still, accepting one of these views where facts about epistemic normativity has to have some dependence upon our psychology, that's like a very big commitment. And it's what I'm not like totally comfortable with, but I do think my view pushes in that direction. And more generally, I think looking at the role that theoretical virtues play in theory choice, in science, and indeed in everyday life, pushes us towards these approaches to epistemic normativity. Right. Okay, so that's the view. I've argued that strikingness has a really important role to play in theory choice. I think we need to understand strikingness if we're to understand scientific practice. It's a really core and important part of our practice. And I suggested a possible approach to strikingness. It's an extremely bold hypothesis, and it has bold implications for epistemic normativity. But hopefully, it's at least somewhat plausible. Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much for that, Harjit. It's our custom to take a 3-minute break. So we'll reconvene on the hour at 4 o'clock.
Perfect.
So Dom, how's Afterlife? Is it nice?
Does it look it? I mean, yeah.
Well, I mean, you look the same. It's just the
yeah. It's the wings.
The surroundings are very different. So.
Yeah, you can't see my little wings.
Huh? That's a good question. That's Dom's talk tomorrow. For Christmas, he will give a paper on,
There's certainly not a ref study submission document in sight. They were the cause of death.
Merry Christmas, Niall. Have fun. and buy a radiator. So Bob, are you happy to be the chair? Is Bob here anyway?
Yes, I'm here.
And what about the first question I asked you?
Well, I'm a Kantian. I'm driven by duty, not happiness, so I will do it if it's my duty.
Exactly. So the question is your duty to chair?
Well, that's a different question.
Well, answer this and we know the answer to the first question.
Well, it's universalizable, I guess, or not, maybe.
Well, so is my duty as well. I mean, let's be clear here. There are...
Yeah, I'll do it.
Is the contrary universalizable? That's the question.
Well, yes, I'm happy to. Well, as I say, I will do it. Are we waiting for Max? Yeah, Max is coming back.
Yeah, although I will have to leave someone because I'm taking the train down to London. That's why I'm not sharing.
By the way, just before we start, do any of you know on how, if there's an easy way to get the speaker to pop up on my screen when on Google Meet?
Yeah, go to the bottom right-hand corner, and there are three.
Yeah.
And if you go to, then there's change layout.
Yep.
And then you can go to spotlight or sidebar.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Great, perfect.
Okay, are we all back? Looks like it. Well, no, Jules is not back. All I can see. Or Chris.
I really enjoyed that talk, Harjit, but I'm also shocked that you're espousing this view.
I'm shocked too.
I never thought I'd hear this coming from you.
No. It was my attempt to do weird philosophy. I love reading weird philosophy, so I thought I might try and do it once.
But now you're infected by it. You're becoming
now I'm infected by it. Yeah,
I'm a weird philosopher.
I know. I was writing this paper and I was trying to think like, what would David Velleman say if David Velleman was a philosopher of science?
I find the view very attractive, but yeah, because you've always thought that my beliefs in this area are a bit perverted. So
yeah, right.
Yeah, it feels like the sort of view that was allowed to have up at Columbia, but like, well, I mean, apart from the Velleman people, but like I've never.
Yeah. No, not at NYU, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, Kitcher accepts this kind of view, not Hartree.
Yeah.
Right, should we get going with questions? Is there any of the graduate students here who'd like to kick off? I don't see any in the chat. No. Okay, so Jonathan, I think, is first on the list.
Hi.
Hi,
Harjit, and thanks. That was a great talk. I really enjoyed it. That was wonderful. So I have a question, I guess, about your view, but maybe the best way to explain it is to locate it. So as the way I see it, you're considering actually three types of views. There are views that are looking for intrinsic properties of the fact to be explained. There are views that are grounded in our epistemic practices. That's the Horwich view number 4. And then there are psychological views. Personally, I wouldn't be so quick to dismiss the epistemic ones. I think they play a necessary role in the explanation, even if not a sufficient one. But focusing on the psychological one, so I'm tempted by going the psychological route, but it looks like your particular version of it is lacking because it doesn't tell us what is it about these facts that make us see authorship in them.
That's right.
It just speculates that for some reason we see authorship there. So, and so I'm wondering if we shouldn't go for a more generalized version of your view, that is just be explicit about it and say, look, it's some psychological feature, and then leave it to empirical research to figure out what is it that psychologically triggers strikingness. And the truth is that I have some speculations, but they're just as good as any others. I think elements of the environment that are such that if we could control them, we'd get some benefits, elements of the environments that are such that they scare us if they occur are striking. And usually these are the kind of things that we also attribute authorship to. So they go along with your view, but at the end of the day, if it's a psychological fact, why not go empirical?
Yeah, good. I have been going back and forth between these two types of approaches, right, actually. Yeah, so like a previous version of the paper, the idea was to like lean more heavily on the empirical stuff and say like, yeah, what it is to be an appearance of authorship is just for the relevant mental module that people like Atran talk about to fire, right? And then it's left to much more to empirical research about exactly the details of what triggers that, right? One kind of problem with that approach is that I think there are certain things which are striking and which call out for explanation in the relevant epistemic sense, but we've just become so used to them, and you're so used to the explanation of them, so used to the non-authorship explanation of them, that they don't kind of lead to the relevant psychological features, right? So, like the tides coming in and out on a regular basis, right? Is that really causing any of those psychological, anything weird psychologically, anything different from observing a non-striking fact, right? I think we're so familiar and so used to certain striking facts that the psychological stuff just doesn't continue to fire, right? But I think what continues to be the case in something like the tides case is that it's still the case that it's a somewhat lovely explanation of the tides that someone's controlling them, right? That's where they go in and out. So I have a lot of sympathy for what you're saying. I feel like maybe I should lean more on the psychology, but I'm worried about these cases where it doesn't seem like there's any interesting psychological phenomena because it's just because the phenomenon in question is so familiar to us, right? But and then related to the kind of one other thing that where you started, you said like one maybe limitation of the account is I don't really give you an account of exactly when there is this appearance of authorship, and I don't give it to you, but there's some theorizing there, right? Like I said, appearance of authorship is when the authorship hypothesis is a lovely explanation, and of course I did not tell you what a lovely explanation is, right? That is a whole thing about in the literature on inference of the best explanation. But still, there's at least some theorizing there about like exactly what features of a situation lead to the authorship hypothesis being a lovely explanation. I'm pushing off that theorizing to like a different part of the literature, but it's not like this account has nothing to say. It just kind of points towards somewhere else, right?
Good. Jonathan, do you want to come back, or is that okay?
Certainly okay for now. There are a lot of questions. I'll come back.
Good. So Chris next.
I think Luca had a finger on that question. Don't know if you want to take
Oh,
Luca.
sorry. Yeah. Yeah. Luca's got a finger and a question. So.
Yeah, I will go very quickly. I mean, because I agree with Jonathan, one ingredient is missing, namely you don't tell us which kind of features trigger the agentive module, but we know what features trigger them. There is a lot of research about that.
Yeah.
And as far as we know, our eyes, movement, and contingent behavior. So, I mean, there is a lot of stuff about, Sean Nichols did a lot of stuff about that. Susan Johnson has a lot of studies. And I don't see how this module can be activated by a sequences of head. So if you're, when you flip a coin, so if you really want to be literal and say, look, what is happening here is the hyper triggering of the agentive module, well, now you are crossing a very narrow path, because for all we know, the evidence doesn't support your account.
Right. Yes, that seems right. So, but that was why I ultimately wanted to. The appearance of strikingness was to do with this claim about loveliness of explanation. The stuff about psychology was to motivate the idea of there being a link between the appearance of explanation and the feeling of need for explanation. Right. So yeah. So I think it was exactly these type of considerations which kind of made me pull back from defining appearance of authorship purely in terms of the psychological thing. The psychological thing now plays a slightly more subsidiary role, but I can see how, probably because this version of the talk was originally one where I did say the thing that you're saying, right? Maybe some remnants of that exist in the talk, right? But officially, appearance of authorship is not supposed to be that.
Okay, good. So now, Chris, I think.
Yeah, thanks very much. This was a very interesting talk. So I had a question really about your strategy. So, I mean, you start off by distinguishing epistemic from psychological relevance of strikingness. And that's in a way what you want to try to vindicate. And then some people who are not willing to follow you down the route that you take at the end might say you haven't really answered that question, but because in a way you end up collapsing the distinction perhaps. But I suppose someone might say, but you have nevertheless given us at least one view that does give strikingness genuine epistemic relevance, and that's the deflationary view. Because it does explain, not everything that we find striking will have epistemic relevance, but it explains why some of what we find striking will have epistemic relevance, and it also explains why it has epistemic relevance when it does. So why is that not a better answer to your initial question than the one that you eventually do give?
Oh, wait. So, just to see I'm tracking. The question is basically, why is the strikingness view not better? Because maybe it doesn't get every case, but it definitely gets the fact that stuff is epistemically relevant.
The deflationary view, yes.
Sorry, the deflationary view. Sorry.
Yes, that's the question. Sorry, yeah.
Great. Yeah. So, in some sense, I do think the deflationary view definitely gets at something, right? I do think it's part of the story, and in fact, this move I made where I said it was there was this terminological thing that I did, right? Where I say for the rest of the talk I'm going to use strikingness in a way which doesn't refer to any feature, any case where a reason to believe a fact has a robust explanation is purely reduced to other epistemic principles, right? That kind of terminological choice actually, in effect, just rules out the deflationary view analytically, right? But I thought I was motivated to do that by pointing to the fact that there are clear cases of strikingness, or intuitive cases of strikingness, where I think the deflationary view fails, right? So basically, what I'm doing